Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Living in the Light. Let's say a prayer. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, Friend, Beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, Beloved Master, Paramahansa Yogananda, Saints of all religions, dearest friend Swami Kriyananda, we open our hearts and minds to your wonderful transforming presence. Live very closely with us so that we always hear your voice, see the aura of light that is the guiding force within us. Help us to move through this world with calm courage, clarity, and devotion always to live by the highest principles that our hearts can reach. We are your children. Guide us and bless us. Om. Peace. Amen. I had a small sneezing fit just before this started, so give me a moment here. There. All right, friends. We are working with this little pamphlet, A New Dispensation. I believe somewhere on the internet, one of the YouTube, perhaps on the YouTube channel, there's a link where you can get a printed copy of this brochure. Some of you have been writing and asking, and that's where it is, I believe. So if you have trouble finding it, let me know. So where are we? Oh yes, we went through a giant one paragraph yesterday in the section called The Divine Ray. And that was, I'm just going to read it again, then go on. Inner proof of the truth of this assertion that this is a special dispensation came easily to me, Swami writes. The more I attune myself to the divine grace flowing through him, through Master, the more everything in my own life flowed smoothly. The opposite proved true also. Whenever I sought to progress spiritually by personal efforts alone without this attunement, I found myself gradually bogging down. You know, there's a phrase here. This is how I spend years going through one book. There's just a phrase here. The more I attune myself to the divine grace flowing through Master. So it's this extraordinarily subtle. It's this personal relationship with someone who isn't a person. And it's very difficult to understand because it is not personality cult. It has nothing to do with infatuation with the superficial characteristics. But nonetheless, there is a specific window. It's exactly as Swami described, often use the image, if you have a frozen lake and you want to get to the water underneath, perhaps to fish, to draw out the treasures that are there, you have to penetrate at one point. You can't just generally sort of stomp on the ice and want to break it. You have to get a focus, an ice pick, a sharp tool, break through at one point, and then you have access to the whole lake underneath it. And so it is in our spiritual life, even though we can talk about all paths lead to the same goal, all masters have the same state of consciousness, there is this relationship. The clue to it is what we see in the human world. There are all these human beings, but we have an affinity with certain ones of them. And in fact, we're even born into affinities. We're born into two sets of, to a mother and a father. We often have siblings, there's grandparents, but out of the millions and billions of people, we have specific relationships, and we may make partnerships as we grow older, whether it becomes your monastic brothers and sisters or your spouse, whatever it might be. These deep relationships grow, and the human world is practice for the divine world. So in the Guru, the ray of grace flowing through Master, very specific. I'm going to just go on from that at the moment, though. It's amazing to me how I've read that many times, and I just never stopped to say the divine grace through him. Swami was very specific. Gradually, too, Swami writes, the objective evidence, because before he's talking about his own experience of attunement and what it means. So now he's talking about objective evidence, as in the case of that woman disciple, where her entire demeanor shifted after Master said, "All right, very well then, I withdraw my ray." And she was tangibly different when she was no longer connected to that ray of grace. And now that I've been a disciple for over 30 years, when Swami wrote this in the early 80s, I can say it with conviction. A special ray of divine grace definitely flows into the lives of those who embrace this path of self-realization sincerely. Now this section is called A Way Out. I've described this truth as a personal discovery, but that doesn't make it new. In fact, it is an ancient teaching, taught in one way or another in every religion. Without grace from above, no way exists for man to escape from delusion. All I've added to this teaching is the conviction born of personal experience. You know, one of the objections that people make, not us, but especially when the whole path of self-realization and yoga and meditation was being introduced in the West, there was a pushback from the Christian community, because the theology of Christianity is that, you know, Jesus Christ died for our sins and that's what saves us. And it was his sacrifice and our belief in him, and that's why we have salvation. And then when you start talking about yoga, where you can do these meditation practices, where you can raise the kundalini, where you can work to free the karma from the chakras, it sounds to them like it's a contradiction, that somehow Jesus isn't powerful enough to do it, or that we're disobeying Jesus because he was the way, the truth, and the light, and no one comes to the Father except through him. So how could these techniques have anything to do with that? In another context, Swami commented that the word kripa, which means grace, he said, is a much more commonly used word in India than even the word grace in the West, because it's understood that we come from the divine in everything. Life itself is a result of his grace, not merely salvation, but it's that power which completely animates our lives. We have nothing. The way Master tried to speak to a Christian monk whom Swami met, and Master asked the monk if you had had a vision of God, and he said no. And Master offered him, you know, the avenue to a vision of God, and by helping him to attune himself through the practice of Kriya. And the monk was persuaded, and after just a little bit of practice, he had very deep spiritual experiences. Master said, not what techniques do for you, he says, if you have a guest coming to your house, he said, and the guest is coming in the front door, you don't stand at the back door waiting for him. You go to where he's going to come, and you open that door for him. And it's not contradictory to the power and the welcome of the guest. It's just courtesy and common sense to go to the portal where he's going to come through. That's what Master described yoga practice as. We're just cooperating with the way grace flows within us. If our minds are restless, if we're always outwardly focused, if we haven't strengthened the inner flow of energy, it just makes it hard for God to reach us. He can't break through all that restlessness. It's really literally preparing the house. When Swamiji would visit the house I lived in, which he did many times, it was always as if Master himself were coming, and you know, we would prepare the whole house. Everything would be made ready for him, because he was our very, very special guest, and that's how we wanted to relate to him. It seemed completely inappropriate to invite him to disorder and lack of preparation. You know, food was purchased, meals were prepared, and you know, we did work in advance. Flowers were everywhere. Why would you not? And that's what we're talking about. It's still the grace. I mean, all of that is for the purpose of welcoming the guest, But in order to welcome the guests, now of course, Swami would have come in the door whether the house was ready or not. With divine grace, we attract it, we magnetize it by our efforts. But in a sense, as I say that, one of the reasons Swamiji came often to stay in this house is because there was a magnetic connection, and that magnetic connection was expressed, among many other ways, by the way we prepared the house for him to come here. So in a way, it really is analogous. So then he says, to understand this truth, and this is how grace plays in our life, Swami's writing, to understand this truth, imagine yourself in the middle of a large, dark building at night. The floor is littered with countless obstacles and broken in many places. At every break is a deep hole. Without some kind of light, wouldn't it be very difficult to get safely out of the building? Again, imagine yourself a prisoner in a labyrinth. Its maze hopelessly complex. Every promising new passageway leading at last, after many turns, to a dead end. In the Greek saga of Theseus, Ariadne gave Theseus a thread to unwind before he entered the labyrinth to fight the Minotaur. Without such a thread, he would never have found his way out. That's the beautiful story. She holds the spool at the end, and he unwinds it. And so he goes in there and he confronts the monster and he fights the monster. And then to get out, he just rolls back up the spool, just follows the string like this. And at the end there she is standing with the spool in her hand. And that's the image that I've always enjoyed the most. I feel it literally like Master has a string. Sometimes I feel like I'm a kite. He's holding the string, and I'm billowing around in the breeze. But the labyrinth is really, really what it feels like. We just go deeper and deeper into the extraordinary complexity of our karmic layer upon layer upon layer. And then you add past lives and all the different ways that we integrate and understand things. Sometimes you'll discover, I'll give an example of this, like there was a woman I know and she adopted two little girls from China, but she didn't adopt them at the same time. She adopted one child and as an infant, and then when that child was about 4, she went back to China to the same orphanage to get a second child, to get a sister for her daughter. And she took her first daughter with her because they were going to get the sister. And the whole time, the first daughter was so sort of nervous and unhappy, and the mother tried in every way to talk about what a happy experience this was. They were going to get the sister and so on. And finally, after they took the second daughter with them and they were sort of back in the hotel and they were all together, all of a sudden the first daughter became completely different. Somewhere in her mind, she had thought she was being exchanged. She thought that she was being, she'd had her time and now she was going to be taken back to the orphanage at China and she was going to be exchanged for another child. Heartbreaking for the mother. But the child just got that thought in her mind. It's very easy to misunderstand. There's another more amusing story with a woman had a toddler, maybe he was 3 years old, and she was pregnant with her second child, and she was near to the due date. And the toddler says to the mommy, "Mommy, when the baby comes, I want to eat him." And the mother thinks, oh dear, sibling rivalry before they're even born. But fortunately, instead of trying to correct him, she said, "Why would you want to do that, honey? So that he can come out of my tummy just like he's coming out of yours." Completely different. But from his perspective, it made perfect sense. How the baby got into the mommy's tummy was a little obscure to him at that point. So it seemed perfectly reasonable. That's how things get into a tummy. Now, these are the second one is funny. The first one is heartbreaking. But children form all kinds of ideas about the world, and much of modern psychology is to help unravel those, especially if children have a traumatic upbringing. Here's another a woman friend of mine, a very dear friend of mine. She was raised by a mother who was a heavy drinker, who was an alcoholic. She was the daughter of a single mother, and the mother was a heavy drinker. And so that was a background story. And I'm talking to this woman friend, and this was not the first time something like this had happened. I have no idea what the subject is now. I simply don't remember. She wanted me to do something for her, which I completely understood why she wanted it, but it wasn't possible for me to do it for her. I just couldn't. I don't know whether it was impossible inherently or it wasn't in my power, but I couldn't do it. And she asked me if I would, and I explained to her why not. And then a little time went by, she asked me again. She asked me about 3 or 4 times, and no matter how reasonably I responded, finally I became very impatient. I said, "Do you think I'm lying to you? Why do you keep asking me?" And she sort of caught herself. I mean, by now, she was 50 years old. She was not a child. She caught herself for a moment. She said, "Oh," she said, "with my mother, she was so unpredictable that her answers were completely random. So if I really wanted something, I would just keep asking and asking, because much of the time she would just suddenly shift her opinion. It would be something else." See, a whole worldview that has nothing to do with reality, but is really, really deep. So we have karmic experiences. We have experiences of multiple childhoods. I had this odd experience, which some of you have heard me talk about before. I used to travel a lot. I will again, but I have traveled a lot. Generally speaking, I'm not a nervous traveler. Well, let me phrase that differently. I'm not a really bold traveler, but I don't have anxiety about being on a plane or something like that. Suddenly, I developed this tremendous anxiety in the airport that if my travel companions were not with me, I was so frightened. I mean, just, not just like a little uneasy, but just terrified. It just came on me from nowhere. And I would have to say, if you're going to walk around the airport and not sit here at the gate, you must be back at exactly this time. And when that time would come close, I'd stand in the aisle. I mean, it was awful. I gradually talked myself out of it because I knew that my companions were not interested in missing the plane. I mean, it was just nuts. A psychic friend of mine, and whether this is literal or apocryphal, she told me that when I was telling this story, as I was just talking about things in a satsang, she said she saw me as a small child, like 6, very small, and that my mother had died, and my father was unable to take care of me, and we got on a train together. He went a few stations away from the village where we lived, and then he just left me in the train station. And after that, I had to fend for myself for the rest of my life. It was very interesting when she told me multiple things happened. The first one was, I said, that was a very hard life. I said, but I developed tremendous strength in that life, and I also developed some very serious character flaws because I had to fight so hard to survive. I became very hard. I developed a hard edge, but the strength of it was positive. The hard edge was a nightmare for me. Now, is any of that true? I don't know. It doesn't really matter. What we're talking about is we often have no idea, really, why we're responding to life the way that we do. We do our best to introspect, and after a time, often we'll get clues or insights or genuine intuitions, but we're constantly being compelled by forces that we don't know. This is exactly what Swami's talking about. We're in a big, dark room, and there's lots of broken places, and we fall into these holes. And we don't know even where the door is because it's too dark. We're in the labyrinth, and I'll compensate for this by developing this, and then I'll compensate for that by developing this, and then I'll compensate for this by developing that. And pretty soon, bang, we're up against another wall, and we don't even know. But if we can be given the thread, because when Theseus was walking out of that labyrinth, he couldn't tell. He couldn't tell what the right turn was. It wasn't that he could reason it or even remember, but he had faith in the string because the woman who loved him was at the other end of it. Divine Mother who loves us is at the other end of it. And that is the power that gets us through. Enlightenment comes to us. It's not that we walk blindly and never know. It's not as if wisdom isn't also a manifestation of God. As we follow that thread out, delusion begins to thin, and we begin to understand more, and we're capable of walking more confidently and more boldly. But as Swami says, if at any point we think, now I have this figured out, now I can do this on my own, as Swami was saying, it never works out. Because even that very thought is often twisted with some kind of misunderstanding, because the ego is the binding force, and it simply doesn't know how to dissolve itself. Even when, because the ego is not evil, it's not our enemy, it's our friend also, but it just lacks the capacity. It just doesn't have the ability to understand how to dissolve itself. It can make the decision that now is the time for me to die, and then therefore we will keep following that thread, but it won't know how to untie the knot. It just doesn't know. It requires that descent from above, and then we come into this relationship with the Guru. I was just reading some words of Swami Kriyananda that were actually out of Light Bearer, and he was talking about how we gradually form this relationship with the Guru. Swami was making the distinction between shiksha, is what it's called, which is someone who follows the Guru, and chela, which is someone who is the Guru's own child. And we can sort of follow the Guru, keeping our own independence, our own self-definitions, and take what we want. And it can help us. Master's teachings are wonderful. His presence is deeply inspiring. Or we can become a child of the Master, in which we absolutely put ourselves in his hands. You know, children are so... I have wonderful, warm memories of my father carrying me from the car into the house when I was too tired to walk. And I have memories of pretending that I was too tired to walk just so he would carry me. I feel very blessed that I had two parents who really loved me and took care of me wonderfully well. But I just remember how completely relaxed I would be in his arms. There was no part of me that felt it had to protect myself from him. This is practice for being chelas. And Swami talks about how at a certain point in our incarnations we're able to say, I am the disciple of a great master. And he says every other accomplishment in life is meaningless compared to that. And it takes a while for us to take that really deep inside, because once we have that, we have the thread, and we're on our way out of the labyrinth. Of course, one has to desire deeply to escape from the labyrinth, which is in and of itself the first step. So now he says, just what I've been saying, now consider how infinitely more complex than any building or than the most intricate labyrinth imaginable is the human mind. Divine grace, like a ray of light, pierces the darkness of this world. By rising upon that ray, and only by rising upon it, can we escape from delusion. Like Ariadne's thread, this ray of grace is our subtle tie to higher reality. By following it, we can trace our way back out of the mind's labyrinth into soul freedom. When we talk about yoga, we talk about how conception takes place. The first cell of the human body, the sperm and ovum come together. Master says that happens at the medulla, at the back of the head, at the base of the brain. That the medulla is the place where life force starts. They say that they can operate on every part of the body, but they can't operate on the medulla because it's the source of life. If they touch this place, life ceases. You can't monkey with it in a physical sense. So what happens when the sperm and ovum unite is the soul from the astral world is attracted. This is the answer to the question, when does life begin? According to Master, at the moment of conception. There's a flash of light in the astral world. Those souls that are ready to incarnate, who are in tune with that light, one, and sometimes more of them, will rush to that light, be magnetically drawn to that light, and will enter in. And then once the soul is present, the magnetic field of karma, which is the chakras, the magnetic field comes with that soul. That's what that soul is. It's an energy field of consciousness at that point. And if a soul is very advanced, I've been told, it doesn't have to confine itself to the womb. It can build the body without having its whole consciousness in the womb. I don't know how that would play itself out, I couldn't say. But the attention and the life force of the jiva is there. And the life force extends out down to the earth chakra. So the first thing that happens is the spine is created. Then the physical body in these nerve plexus at points that relate to the chakras. Where the chakras are is the power, and then that power begins to draw to it the physical, the atoms and so on that make a physical body. So the body is built out from the center. That's how everything that is living is made. It grows from the center. The seed expands from the center. When we manufacture something, we get the pieces and we assemble them. I've been sewing many of these cloth masks that people needed to wear during this pandemic of 2020, and I have all these different piles. I have the liner that goes in, I have the two outside pieces, I have the string, I have the elastic, I have the little wire. I pick up all those pieces and I put them together. It's not a living thing. It doesn't have inherent within it the capacity to manifest itself. So it's assembled, but we manifest ourselves. And we manifest ourselves by descending out to the base of the spine, then expanding out to the limbs. And I'm saying this because I have been present when people have died. I've been with them when they're transitioning. And sometimes it's exceedingly dramatic because you watch the life force withdraw. And a person's hands and feet will get very cold, and often the person will lose the capacity. They don't know where their limbs are anymore. And then you can actually just watch the life force. The extremities become inert, and then the trunk of the body, and then you can sometimes watch it through the breath or through physical movement. It literally comes right up the spine. It just comes right up the spine like this, and then it at least reaches the medulla. And what the challenge is at this point, as Swami says, is to rise into the spiritual eye and exit going upward, or else we just relax backward into the medulla. We rest again into our individual self instead of transcending it in spirit. But it's very, very dramatic to watch. It's just Ariadne's thread. You just watch someone, okay, I've been out in this huge material world, now I'm finished, like this. Even the heartbeat will move up to the throat. It moves past the heart. You see it in the throat. When Tushti passed away and she came very close to exiting many times, breath would get exceedingly shallow and the heartbeat would be in her throat. And everything else would become lifeless. Then in her case, she would decide that she had more karma to work out, and the belly would suddenly move, and she would take another big breath and just come back in and stay for another few weeks before she finally exited. Great mysteries that we're living with, and the more deeply we allow ourselves to really receive and experience those mysteries, the more glorious and free our lives can become. God bless you, my friends.